So this one is, I wrote this one this week, and it's about how to integrate millennials into intergenerational workplaces. And so what this study was, it was actually a literature review on millennials in relation to intergenerational differences in the workplace. And so they examined what are the characteristics of the millennial generation, what must be done to manage millennials specifically effectively, specifically millennials in the workplace, and then how can intergenerational employees work together productively. 17 studies were analyzed to look at this, and we're basically finding common narratives and common themes that related to guiding millennials productively in the workplace. And millennial is defined here, which is not the same in other studies and especially for marketing too. I know it's different, but millennials is defined here as born between 1978 and 2000, which is a combination of Generation Y and some Gen Z as well. I know other studies
1978 is generation. I'm 1979. I thought I was Generation X.
I thought so too.
That's an early date for a millennial. I'm a millennial according to this.
Well, you know,
You're on the cusp.
Take that up with them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I find it interesting too how they describe this, because technically Gen Z, like I'm the cusp of Gen Z is 1997, and 1996, 7, 8 is where Gen Z begins, and so it also is strange there. But anyways, we'll move on. So the study focused on obviously figuring out the differences between millennials. There's a lot of findings here, a lot of different advice that they gave. One of these pieces is that millennials, people say millennials have less drive, or that they're lazier at work than previous generations. But it would be better to say that millennials are driven by different priorities. That work life and personal life are more integrated for these individuals, and I'm interested to see how that will change with and be more the case with COVID too. But and so multitasking is also something that's been shown in their generation is more prevalent than previous. Millennials have less respect for hierarchy compared to previous generations, believing respect is earned through bringing something to the table. And the study also listed strategies for dealing with intergenerational differences in the workplace, and specifically with millennials. And they focused on the fact that, or the advice that some management should lay clear expectations for employees and provide role clarity, showing millennials how their individual role contributes to the company. They can utilize the technological strength that some millennials have compared to older generations by asking them to use this ability for access to information. And there's a lot of different things included in this, like mentorship programs, de-emphasizing generational competition and emphasize intergenerational collaboration, things like that. And then also just to put this out there as well. And I'll be honest, I had a struggle with reading studies like this in general, but with this study, because I actually wrote wrote a summary of another study about a year ago on generational differences in the workplace. And that study essentially argued that, labeling things as generations and changing your behavior based on that is it's just ageism. It's just a thinly veiled form of discrimination and ageism. And so I have trouble sometimes finding a balance between those two things. And so I added this to the end, and the author kind of mentioned this as well in the study, is that there is an importance of finding a balance between recognizing intergenerational differences and labeling individuals based on their generation. Because it's important sometimes to understand the realities of how younger people are different from older people based on how and when they were raised. But, it's equally important to be careful of stereotyping someone because through a generational lens. And so, I think that's a good point, or a good thing to just focus on for a second, just because I think, it can get a little bit scary once you start labeling people. But yeah, and then the key takeaway was just that strategies like clear expectations, technology, implementing trainings can be helpful in integrating millennials to the workplace. And recognizing that intergenerational differences are not as large as they may seem. And the different generations of employees should be encouraged to work together and learn from each other. Actually, that last point too, recognizing that intergenerational differences may not be as large as they seem. One of the key findings that they found here was that younger people's readiness to change is not much different from older people's readiness to change. Like it's very similar. So overemphasizing is not a good thing, and I think is the worry of this. But I'm interested to hear what you all think about this, and we'll open it for discussion.
I enjoyed reading this study as well because I thought it was really interesting, particularly because I'm one of the youngest people here. So I thought this was pretty interesting. I do agree that like there are generational differences, and I was born in 2000, so some people say I'm a millennial, some people say I'm not. It really depends on which study you read. But I definitely agree that there are generational differences. I can tell, not just here, but like in general, like talking to my parents, like there are certain perspectives they have because they were here when Bush got elected, for example. So we have different perspectives about the election and things like that. But I also agree with Noah's point about how like, while we shouldn't be overemphasizing those differences or taking from those differences that one generation is superior to the other, I do think that different generations bring different viewpoints and different perspectives to the table. And I think that when you have a very healthy way of articulating that and bringing those differences to the table and making sure that everyone feels heard, then you can have some really great conversations. I think though the danger is when you start to be like, oh, well, you're older, so you know more, and this 19-year-old, we don't need to listen to that 19-year-old, they don't know what they're talking about. That's, I think, when you get the issues there. But I think if you have someone who's 55 and someone who's 21, they have perhaps different perspectives on certain things, but I think they both can come to the table. So I don't think we should try and squash those differences or try and be like, you know, everyone have the same opinion. I don't think that's really helpful because I think you lose really valuable perspectives.
Yeah, the diversity of perspectives is important. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. I really like this study, and Noah, thank you for pointing out the fact that millennials and are, as far as like the comfort and change, it's the same as like, you know, older generations, because I think so many times we as millennials, and I'm like a later millennial born in 90, and like a lot of times we think, oh, like we're comfortable with change and older generations are not. They're stuck in the traditions and, you know, they want to stay that way. But it's, as you, Alyssa, you pointed out too, it's more of just like our perspective, right? Like everyone, we all see life through a keyhole, and what we know is going to, like, as millennials, we're seeing very different things, but so the change of like going backwards or even going forward now to like, I know I struggle with the generation, what's next, Z, like like I struggle with that because it's so different than like what I was raised on and things like that. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. It's like the comfort in change crosses all generations, and so we shouldn't act as though one is more apt to changing versus the other. This reminds me actually of a client of ours from a while back that, I mean, that was a clear distinguishing factor of like the conflict was the intergenerational makeup of the employees, and it kind of like led to, I don't know if I'm at liberty to like say it out loud right now.
What's going to be on YouTube, so probably shouldn't.
Okay, I won't then. But it was really, it pretty much aligned with this and acknowledging, but everyone initially, it was an organizational assessment where everyone kind of thought, oh, the younger, kind of more tech savvy, newer employees were butting heads. And yes, they were butting heads with older generations. However, they all were like both groups, if we want to group them, you know, were stuck in their own thoughts and their own ways of identifying what the actual problem was. Oh, they don't want to change. Oh, they don't want to learn new things, kind of thing. When it was both.
Yeah, they're both framing the circumstances differently based on their perspective, based on their, you know, sort of worldview.
Yeah.
I know that we're short on time, but I gotta say, I have a lot of holes in this. I see a lot of holes. If this, I don't know if this was peer reviewed or not, But one, as you all pointed out, the age group thing is really weird. You know, there's somebody who wrote the book about Gen X and he defined the periods. And so it's weird that those dates would change so drastically. Two, labeling millennials as narcissistic, recent research has shown that personalities can change over time and people often become less narcissistic as they get older. So what's to say that the older generations weren't as narcissistic when they were at that point?
Yeah.
Three, regional events. This article was from what, South Africa, I think. One of the things that's unique is baby boomers in the US had the Vietnam War. There are very, very few other countries whose cultures were as pronounced, as affected by the Vietnam War. I mean, Canada, it's not a thing. Mexico, it's not a thing. So to your point, Alyssa, about seeing things through a different lens based on, say, who was president, that kind of thing. Exactly. But I think that we can't chunk the whole Western world together because there are vast differences. For me, the Challenger explosion, that kind of thing. Yeah, and then lastly, the stage of life. I kind of pointed to it before, but I feel like we need to do some research on what the relative differences are between age cohorts, as far as when I was 20 to 30 years old, this is what my group personality was like. Because I think we're going to find some consistency as people age, what their group. So anyway, yeah, not to be the naysayer, but I think it's a good start, but I would have a lot of issues with this one.
I mean, I completely agree. As I was reading this, I was like, I felt like there were some holes in this to some degree. And I mean, even just, yeah, I agree. And the narcissistic thing also, there are a lot of things in there where, as like a millennial / Gen Z person, I was like, well, this isn't very nice. Like, they're telling me my parents were helicopter parents and I'm a narcissistic person all the time. It's like, well,
well, no, I've told you that several times that you're a narcissist.
Great.
I agree. Yeah. It seems biased a little bit.
Well, I think anytime that we start grouping people into categories and saying this is how the group acts, like that's a little bit dangerous. And because I mean, I'm constantly surprised by, if I'm reading something and it goes, almost, because like we deal with this a lot with in conflicts in companies where there's a manager and he goes, all these millennials are entitled and they think this and they don't have to work for that and all that stuff. And they don't appreciate blah, 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 so all that stuff. And there's this stigma out there about millennials, aren't hard workers, and millennials are, and I'm constantly surprised if I was to buy into that, and the millennials that I work with and then I work around and stuff like that, like I'm constantly surprised by how hardworking they are. It's like there's lots of exceptions to the rule if that's a rule, and I don't think that it is. But anyway, it's there is a stigma here, and maybe the problem itself is the stigma. Maybe the problem itself isn't the actual reality of it, but like just the stigma of it, and stigma set people up to kind of live into the stigma in some way, or to just be perceived in that stigma.
Yeah, I feel like it's the stigma that's the issue, to be honest, because some people say I'm a millennial, some people say I'm Gen Z. I'm right on the cusp, so I don't really know. I'm kind of in Noah's boat, like we both could go either way. But I definitely get the stereotype all the time of like, my parents were helicopter parents and I was coddled, and I'm like, no, that's not true, like at all. And I know a lot of people like that, and I definitely feel like some people do buy into that. And similarly, as young people, we, are told on Twitter, people like, oh, the baby boomers ruined the economy, like they're to blame for society today. So there's definitely stigmas that go both ways, and I don't know that that's fair either. Like, I wasn't alive when the baby boomers were born, obviously, so I have no idea like what they grew up experiencing to what was said earlier, like I don't know what happened to shape their point of view, and it's perhaps just an age thing. As you get older, you become less narcissistic. So were baby boomers as quote unquote narcissistic as millennials are often branded when they were in their 20s and 30s? Like, we don't really have a lot of research on that. We seem to have a lot more claims about narcissism in millennials. And I don't know if that's even a fair generalization either. Yeah, I don't know if the idea of 20 to 30-year-olds being more narcissistic than 40 to 50-year-olds is even an accurate assessment to make in and of itself. So yeah, I agree. I see some holes in this as well.
I'm pretty firmly a Gen Xer, and everybody just forgets about me, so that's fine.
Yeah. Well, you know, the one thing that oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just gonna say about the key takeaway and like applying this to the workforce. I think that the biggest issue is that we shouldn't recognize the intergenerational differences. We shouldn't group and label people as according to their age, as we've all talked about. And so maybe this key takeaway is not the best key takeaway applied to the American workforce.
I almost agree, yeah.
I'll throw out this proposal. This first line here in the results, it says, well, some, you know, they maybe have less drive than previous generations, but it would be better to say that they're actually driven by different priorities. I think as we progress, and I hate to use the word enlightenment, but as we become a little bit more self-aware, maybe, is just as human beings in our Western society, we I think we prioritize human needs a little bit more. And like in older generations, I noticed that, you know, my grandparents worked in the same job for 30 or 40 years, right? With not much growth. It was just like, if I get a steady income and I can pay for my bills, my house, and I'll take a vacation once a year, that's a good life. And that was the expectation then. And that's cool. That's how it was. But now the priorities and the needs that are being prioritized are different. It's not about just a steady income. I want to feel intrigued. I want to feel like I have purpose. I want to feel like I'm driven by something deeper and all that stuff. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. They're just motivated. We're all motivated by different things now. And I would make a suggestion that it's not just millennials who are now motivated by those things. I think most of the workforce, I think everybody that does employee engagement measurements understands that it doesn't matter whether you're 20 or you're 50. Everyone's driven by having some purpose, some vision about the future. I mean, you know, it's not enough to just get a steady paycheck anymore.
I wonder what shifted that trend, though. That's my curiosity, is why are we now moving towards prioritizing mental well-being and do I like this job? Do I enjoy what I'm doing? Maybe that's
maybe it started with the Vietnam War. Maybe it started with the counterculture, with the counterculture movement. You know, we're fighting against the norm, the establishment. You know, like what we're fighting for, our individuality and our freedom and our creative expression and our purpose in life and all that stuff. And maybe that's the thing that morphed into this.
I think that's a really, really good point there. I'm part of a group, Veterans for Peace, around here, and I've learned so much from veterans on like the peace movement here in the US and like what really changed, and how I think you nailed it right there as far as a turning point in this priority shift of like seeing things differently, really.
Yeah.
But I do think it's also important to talk about, and I know that this is kind of varying a little bit off of what we're focusing on, but the being able to say, this is not enough for me to just clock in, clock out, and have a steady income. I need to also be fulfilled by this job is a luxury that some people still do not have. Like my mother is an immigrant and she's a Black woman, so she doesn't have that same flexibility that my dad might. Like my dad quit his job and started his own company. My mom has worked at the same job for 20 years and she does not like it at all. So I think it's important to also talk about, depending on what community you're a part of, whether it's ethnicity, race, or gender, the flexibility and the allowances that you are given to prioritize different things. Not everyone can and does prioritize those things because some people are still not able to do that. So I think it's important to talk about that as well.
Alyssa, would you say that the opportunity for that may not be there, and that's kind of what we're working towards? How do we get everyone to have an opportunity to do meaningful work? But even though the opportunity is not there, the need is still there, right? I mean, she would opt for that if that opportunity was there.
Yeah, I think it just boils down to if she decides to leave her job now at 50 plus years old, does she have any more options? And I think, again, it's about age too. Like, if I'm 20, I don't have kids and a family and a mortgage and college to pay for, so I can just decide that I don't want to do this job. My mom, who has 2 kids to put through college and a mortgage and a husband, can't wake up and decide that she doesn't like her job anymore. It's not enough to just get a paycheck. So I think that's something to consider as well. I also think when she was younger, coming to this country as an immigrant, she's just trying to get the job that will pay, because as an immigrant, she already doesn't really have the same opportunities that someone who's born in the United States would. So I think it just comes down to access and how you can open up those doors for people who may not necessarily have the same opportunities as someone. Because I have opportunities that my mother didn't when she was 20, that my dad didn't when he was 20, just because of generational things that have changed. So I think it's a very complicated thing, and I know we could have like a whole other conversation on this because we're over time, but yeah.
Well, I have a question, because we're talking here about Western ideals, Western society, and our human needs and how they manifest for us in our particular culture.
Right.
And I wonder, do you think that wanting to do purposeful work that feels interesting and maybe inspiring, do you think that that's a human universal, or do you think that that's just a cultural universal? Because I think in other parts of the world,
a cultural thing. I think that is a very, not even just a cultural thing, but an American thing, I would say. Because definitely in my mother's Caribbean, like I said, in the Caribbean household, you don't say, I'm quitting my job, this doesn't fulfill me. Like, that's not something you do. My roommate is Indian, same thing there. Like, you don't do that. And when you pick a career, it's something that's going to pay the bills. So you don't say, I'm going to get a job as a artist. Like, that's not something that you do in Caribbean cultures and also in immigrant cultures. One of my best friends is Nigerian. It's the same thing. These cultures tend to be so closed off to less typical traditional job opportunities and roles because of the stability, right? So my mom coming to the United States, she's looking for something that's going to be stable, and that's not going to be as an artist in her view. So when I tell her, if I were to tell her, hey mom, I want to change my career and work as a journalist, she would be like, okay, well, is that going to pay the bills? Is that stable? Do you, like, there's a lot more restrictions on what's socially acceptable in terms of moving your jobs and changing opportunities, because the door to even get into the job market is a little bit harder for immigrant communities in the first place. So it's like, if you can finally open that door for yourself, why would you pick something that's not even guaranteed to be stable or bring in an income?
Yeah, it's like work in other places is framed a completely different way. It's not about doing something meaningful. It's like paying the bills, making sure you've got food on the table.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the difference between a lot of, like, your individualist cultures and then your collectivist cultures, and how just the priorities is different. Like, that's going to change all of this. So I feel like thank you for sharing all of that, Alyssa. Very, very insightful, and I'm glad that you did.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alyssa.
You're welcome.
All right.